The following Frederick W. Reynolds Lecture is a production of Continuing Education at the University of Utah.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ann O'Brien, and I'm with Continuing Education, and I have the joy of welcoming you this morning, and a special welcome to our Ames High Schoolers. Thanks for coming, and I'm sure you'll enjoy this morning's presentation. I want to talk a little bit about the Reynolds history. Since 1936, the Frederick William Reynolds Lecture has been an important part of the University of Utah and of continuing education. The Reynolds Lecture was originally developed for members of the faculty to present important, timely subjects to audiences of their peers in the public. Many distinguished university faculty members have taken part in this annual lecture, always providing stimulating, provocative, and sometimes controversial subjects. The series has also served as a way to open the university and its research and its work to the community. Throughout the years, the Reynolds Lecture has remained true to continuing Ed's mission by extending the great resources and learning opportunities of the university to the community. And this year's Reynolds Lecture, a grown-up conversation about games, mind, body, and soul, is no exception. I'm sure all of us have been affected by the fairly new world of computer gaming. I actually remember when my father brought home the flight simulator that was on a Commodore, and also Pong. I don't know if you all remember Pong. Does anybody remember any of those? Oh, good. Okay. I see the high schoolers, none of them raised their hand, which I wouldn't expect. But those were, believe it or not, they were mind-blowing to us. And when you think about where we were then and where we are today, it's mind-blowing again. I mean, it has just changed at such a rapid pace. If you guys ever saw Pong, you would be bored to death, let me tell you. Anyway, we're excited about this morning's lecture. We have the Entertainment Arts and Engineering program is they're our presenters today. The program is actually ranked the #1 undergraduate program of its kind in the country, and is ranked the #2 graduate program of its kind in the country as well. This program enables interdisciplinary work between the College of Engineering and the College of Fine Arts, which is, that's kind of a unique new endeavor to see those two colleges come together. Students learn to collaborate with one another and get real-life experience by developing games and programs as part of their coursework. This partnership between disciplines reflects the current state of the interactive entertainment business while preparing students to work effectively in a team environment. We're excited to have the faculty from the Entertainment Arts and Engineering program as our presenters for this year's Reynolds Lecture. This year's lecture will explore the possibilities within the video gaming industry, from the ethics of gaming to video games designed to heal our bodies. This year's lecture will also be a little different from past years. How many of you are familiar with the TED Talk series? I think some people. So that is a rapid fire presentation. So we will have 3 presenters from that program this morning, each presenting about 20 minutes each. So we're really excited to have 3 different voices today. First up, we'll have Dr. Robert Kessler, who will present on an academic overview of gaming. Dr. Kessler is the executive director and the co-founder of the Entertainment Arts and Engineering program here. He holds a PhD in computer science from the University of Utah and is a professor of computer science. He received both the College of Engineering Outstanding Teaching Award and the University Distinguished Teaching Award for his work to inspire students. His latest research interests lie in games for health. Then we'll hear from Dr. Roger Altizer Jr. Dr. Altizer is a co-founder of the Entertainment Arts and Engineering program, where he is also an associate professor. Dr. Altizer is the director of game design and production, as well as the director of therapeutic games and applications for the Center for Medical Innovation. He co-founded an indie game co-op called Game Makers Anonymous. He has designed and developed indie and medical games, and he has spent a decade as a games journalist. He frequently is a guest commentator on games issues, both locally and nationally, and has presented his games research at international conferences, Dr. Altizer will speak on therapeutic games. I think you need more titles. Right. And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Jose Segal. Dr. Segal is a visiting professor who is a game scholar and designer and author of The Video Game Ethics Reader. His research explores the challenges of using games as the subject of learning, and he seeks to understand how learning happens in these environments and how to improve it. Dr. Segal is also interested in ethics of gaming and whether games may encourage people to behave ethically or do the right thing. Dr. Segal will wrap up the 2014 Reynolds Lecture and will present on the soul of ethical gaming. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished professors.
Good morning. Let's get this party rolling. Okay, so this is the EAE faculty, and we've got Bob, if you can't tell, Roger on the left, and Jose on the right. So each of us will be speaking today. So my goal is to talk about a little bit about video games and maybe twist your thinking about them a little bit differently than maybe you are thinking about. So what is a video game? Well, if you ask most people, they might come up with a definition like this: a super violent time waster played by teenage boys. And if you look at them, this is what you'd see, right? Video games, going around, killing things imaginarily. That's what they see. And if you see what's on the other side of that, we have a couple of kids in a basement with their eyes glued to a screen. And the statistics bear that out. 99% of boys under 18 play regularly, and 94% of girls under 18 play regularly. That's astounding, those kinds of numbers. But what about games like this? Solitaire, Angry Birds, they're also video games. Are these people video gamers? Well, here's another statistic. 47% of all game players are women. And there are more adult women playing video games than boys 17 and under. Whoa. Video gamers? How many times have you been out in public and you've seen someone giving their very young children a tablet computer to play video games on? So, whoops. Some other statistics: 62% of gamers play games with others. So this is a fairly new trend over the last 5-10 years. More social play of games. 58% of gamers play on portable devices. 10 years ago, there weren't that many portable devices around. So again, another new trend. And 75% of all American households play video games. Again, a huge number. So games are pervasive, as I've shown you. They have a broad appeal, and they've been part of our history and culture. We've been playing games since we've been human. But so what? Well, games are big business. Here's some numbers that show the domestic sales of video games compared to the movie box office domestic. And so those kinds of numbers, everyone knows about movies and how big of an industry it is. Turns out the game industry is actually bigger than that. And as you can see, worldwide, $78 billion in 2012 in games, and projected to go up to $111 billion in 2015. Those are big numbers. So if there's a lot of industry out there, what does that mean? Well, it also means that it can be highly profitable. The latest winner in that is Grand Theft Auto 5. $800 million the first day, $1 billion in 3 weeks, and it cost them roughly $140 million to make this. And in reality, it was about half that to make it and about half to market it. And it clearly paid off. So they made a ton of money. What does that mean? That means jobs. So the pervasive history and culture, there's jobs. But video games at a university, I mean, come on. Why study games? Well, it turns out there's a lot of effects that we can have on games, and the way that games affect society, games as art, design patterns, human activity, serious games. There's all different areas of games and how games are used in the world and by humans and players that makes for interesting study. Games are also intellectually challenging. If we train our students to play games, yes, but mostly to design games, it encompasses a broad range of specialties. If you look at on the left-hand side, engineers, it covers so many areas of computer science, it's mind-boggling. And that goes for artists, producers, and game studies people. So it's intellectually challenging, it's interesting. What about making games? What we do in our EAE program is we have large teams of interdisciplinary students working together to make games, all the way from here's an idea of a game to its actual publishing as a product. And these are some of the games that we've published over the last 4 years that are actually running on Xbox 360 game consoles today. And students learn about how to work together and how to actually take something to the final version. So that's important. We also do this at the master's level too. Our master's students must also produce games. And again, they learn how to go from the beginning to the end. One of the most important differences between our master's and our undergrad students are the master's students have to have a thesis for their game. In essence, what can this game demonstrate, or what can this game prove? So one of the games that we did 2 years ago is a game called Eerie. And Eerie's thesis was fear. Can we make the player be afraid? And so that's interesting. And how do you measure something like that? It turns out there's this strange internet phenomena where people will play games, and while they're playing the game for the very first time, they have a second camera. They have a camera that's showing the gameplay, but they have a second camera showing the face of the person that's playing the game. So you can see their reactions to playing the game. So we put together a clip of people who have played the Eerie game, which are now on YouTube with millions of people watching people play video games, which is a little strange. But let me show you some of those clips.
What is that? Oh my! Oh, that hurt my heart. That one hurt my heart.
Okay, so clearly they got the fear thing down, and we're very good at doing this. We figured out a way to teach this, and now, as you can see, we're ranked as the #1 and #2 game programs in the country. So to wrap that up, games are pervasive. We have a history and culture. They're big business, which means jobs. There's important topics in game studies. It's intellectually challenging, and we're really good at it. But it's games, you know? Games. Games are just fun. Why games? Well, it turns out that games aren't just for entertainment. Here's a really interesting example. It's a program called Fold It, and this was done at the University of Washington. And what it was is scientists were trying to figure out how to determine the proper folding pattern of proteins. And when proteins turn into the correct shape, then they can do their jobs. And scientists have been trying to figure out the shape of these proteins for years, and they weren't able to do it. So what they did is they created a game that in essence was like a crowdsourced game, and had tens of thousands of people play this game and change the shapes of proteins until they found one that actually met their criteria. And after a couple of weeks, they were able to discover the shape of the particular protein they were after, and then also many other proteins after that. So by using games, they're actually able to solve a problem that they were unable to solve prior to that. We've also ventured into this area, including games for education. So this is one we did with the National Energy Foundation, which was to try to teach young teens natural gas safety. And the game goes along, and as the players playing the game, it eventually will ask them questions about about various issues of natural gas and the safety of that. And so the students will learn something. We've also got another game that we did last summer on the Shoshone language. The idea of this game was that the Shoshone language is something that's dying out. Maybe we can make a game that helps teach what the language is all about. So this leads us to an interesting fact. It turns out that games actually are physiologically different than other forms of entertainment. What this slide shows is, in essence, your brain on games and your brain on watching someone play games. The images on the left show the game as a functional MRI image of someone playing a video game, and these things that are lit up are the reward centers in the brain. And the ones on the right are someone watching someone play a game, and the reward centers aren't being lit up. And what this means is that there's a physiological change that goes on by playing a game. It makes you happy. It makes you excited. And because of that, we can actually take advantage of that factor in gumes. So here's an example of a study that was done last year where they took people and they had them play a video game. These were seniors, had them play a video game. First they measured their cognitive age, played the video game, and then measured their cognitive age after playing the video game. And they compared people playing crossword puzzle versus people playing the video game. And what they discovered was that the people playing the crossword or playing the video games, their cognitive age got less. So they got younger mentally and reduced the effects of aging. For the seniors, or for the people playing the crossword puzzle, there was no difference. There was the standard decline. And the other thing that's fascinating about this is then they went in 6 months later and measured it, and their cognitive age had still improved. So not only is it something that happens by doing the action, but then it's long lasting. So this is pretty exciting. Here's another example of a news piece on multitasking.
A lot of people, mostly moms, say that video games can rot your brain, but a neuro research lab at UC San Francisco actually found the opposite to be true. They designed a video game called NeuroRacer to train cognitive functions. Their study showed people from ages 60 to 85 who played NeuroRacer improved their multitasking, and by the end of the study, some even had the multitasking ability of a 20-year-old. The researchers caution that you may not be able to get these benefits from just any video game, so to make sure you're covering your bases, you're gonna want to play every video game all of the time.
I particularly like that ending part. So, let's wrap up. Games are pervasive, they're part of our history, they're big business and therefore jobs. They have important topics that we can study. They're challenging to create and therefore interesting as far as education. We're good at it, and they can be used to educate and train your minds. Next up, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how we can use games to work on your body. And that would be Roger.
First, I want to thank Continuing Ed and all the partners who make this lecture series possible. It is an honor to be here today. And I have a confession to make. So when we first started talking about this, I pitched the name an adult conversation about games. And unfortunately, it confused a lot of people because they thought we were going to be talking about things like sex in video games. And then that's not our topic here today. But we are going to talk about the body and interesting things about the body and video games. The body in video games is something that people tend not to relate. They tend to think of the mind in video games. And there's some stickers in the audience because you probably know this game. This isn't a therapeutic video game. This is Surgeon Simulator. And Surgeon Simulator is a game where you do surgery and you're really bad at it. It's very difficult. The hand is difficult to control. You're constantly making mistakes, and the game shows the results of that. But the idea is that the body is an important part of games, and we're going to get to why games are good for the body. Now, science is still out on how good Guinness is for your body, but we actually have good studies on what games do to us physiologically. First, there's some obvious facts. We all know that anxiety and depression are bad, right? These are not good things for us. In fact, currently, anxiety and depression count as the second most debilitating thing that adults 15 to 44 currently face. So anxiety and depression are the second most debilitating disorders for folks 14 to 55, for both men and women. So this is a gigantic problem. By 2020, this will be the single most expensive problem other than mortality. So let's move forward. The first solution to these kinds of disorders is drugs. And we know that people take a lot of drugs to deal with anxiety and depression. Unfortunately, this type of therapy is only available to about 25% of the people who suffer from it. So we have another solution for you. Bejeweled. So how many people here remember the game Bejeweled? Oh, quite a few people. Good. Bejeweled was a very popular game for a very long time. It was estimated that one copy of Bejeweled was being sold every 10 seconds at its height. So it was a game that made a ton of money without being as violent as Grand Theft Auto. Bejeweled has inspired a number of clones that are out there, and we've seen games like Candy Crush and all sorts of popular games. Some researchers at East Carolina University took to an interesting study, and their study was that Bejeweled could be used to treat anxiety and depression. So how did they go about it? They did a couple of play sessions in the lab. They had a group of people come and play Bejeweled for a half hour while being observed, hooked up to all sorts of monitoring equipment. They also had them take Bejeweled home and play it for 30 minutes 3 times a week. Now, people are bad at following instructions, so the average person actually played it for 40.7 minutes 3 times a week. Because, you know, when it's going well, you want to keep going, right? So they did EEG tests, so they're measuring what's happening in the brain. They did HRV tests, meaning they measured variability in heart rate, which is a normal thing that you measure when you're looking at anxiety. And they did paper-based tests to study the psychology of this, or the psychological effect of this. And here's what they found. They found that there were significant reductions in depression, that the people with depression that reported depression at the beginning, so they did a test, they said you have moderate to severe depression, they moved on the scale to minor or minimal depression. They also saw less anger in the people that played it, increased vigor, and decreased fatigue. So this means that their anxiety was also decreased in both state and trait. State anxiety is when you get all stressed out because of a particular event. You have a major test coming up, you find out that you're pregnant, your car isn't working anymore. These things cause anxiety in your life. Trait anxiety, you know, we all have this friend, someone who is stressed out, right? Someone who operates at a high level of anxiety. And we saw reductions in both of those. So it's exciting results. Their conclusions are also exciting. The idea that they came up with was, since there are significant positive results, and they ran this study multiple times for both depression and anxiety, that they suggest prescribing video games as an alternative therapy to drugs. That you could actually use video games, and not necessarily video games designed to treat depression, but you could use casual video games as a therapeutic tool to decrease depression and anxiety. It's amazing. If you think about the problems that we have with pharmaceuticals in our nation, the massive expense they have, the horrible side effects, this is an exciting result. But this isn't the only game that actually helps people deal with these issues. Let's look at another one. Snow World is an exciting game. It was developed at the University of Washington. They're doing groundbreaking work in this. And I'm going to show you a little video clip so you get an idea of what it looks like and the scope of the problem that it's tackling.
I was on fire. I couldn't see to unbuckle my seatbelt or open the door. I believe my guardian angel just took me out of the truck.
First Lieutenant Samuel Brown survived an attack on his Humvee in southern Afghanistan, but he would then have to endure rounds of surgery, skin grafts, and painful skin stretching.
This is a battle that's going to take years to get back to being how it was prior to this.
But while Brown's body fights that battle, virtual reality technology lets his brain enjoy hurling snowballs to the music of Paul Simon.
Snow World looks silly. You throw snowballs at penguins, mastodons, and snowmen, and you travel through this canyon doing it. listening to Paul Simon along the way. You're using a virtual reality headset, and your hand is on a mouse. But what does it do? It reduces pain 35 to 50% in people who are going through some of the most painful therapy a person can go through. When Sam Brown was first burned, and he was burned over 30% of his body, his mouth was reduced to the size of a dime. The number of surgeries that it took to get his mouth back into a normal shape was unimaginable. It's taken years to get him to this state. And the process was extremely painful. Frequently, he had to quit the therapies. He said he couldn't take the scrubbing of the skin, the stretching of the skin. Snow World has allowed him not only to endure the therapies, but to endure many of them without morphine. So he's down to 0 morphine for some of the procedures. This is a therapy that's being used all over the country now, and many hospitals are using it to treat burn victims. And so the question is, how does this work? There are a lot of theories about how it works. It could be the old, please look over here while we peel off your Band-Aid and you don't see it, or look away while you're getting a shot, so it could be simple distraction. It could be the metaphor of snow has a cooling and soothing effect in the mind. There are a number of things that could be working here, and that's what we're interested in studying. What is happening inside of the mind when we play games, and how can we use it for therapeutic benefits? So that research is happening, and it's happening today. Researchers at RIT looked at 2 specific video games. They've been studying eyesight in video games for quite some time. Previous studies they have done show that action gamers, people who play first-person shooters, are able to track more items on a screen moving than people who don't play action games. They also show that people can differentiate state change quicker. So if you see a bunch of cards that are flipped over and they flip over again, action gamers are better at identifying which ones are flipped over. So this study involved 2 specific video games. They looked at 2 different action games, Call of Duty 2, as well as Unreal Tournament 4, and then they looked at The Sims 2, Pets, 2 very different video games. If you look at The Sims looks something like this. When it was first pitched as a virtual dollhouse, and then it became more of a real-life simulator. So you have a family, and you have a job, and you have activities, and your kids are always knocking things over and locking themselves in the restroom, and you run a household, and it's a lot of fun. People have played The Sims for years, for a long time. It was the #1 selling PC game in the history of PC games before MMOs like World of Warcraft came out. Call of Duty 2 is much what you'd expect. Call of Duty 2 is a first-person shooter. You are the greatest soldier in World War II. You go from battle to battle, and you seem to make the difference every single time. So it's much like other first-person shooters that you've played. And you run around using all sorts of weapons to dispatch foes. The exciting thing that they measured, though, was that people who played Call of Duty, as opposed to The Sims, saw increased contrast sensitivity function, which is they could see shades of gray and shades of color better than those who were playing The Sims. And they showed increased ability, dramatically increased ability. The question of why still remains. One of the theories operating is that there's something beneficial about constantly focusing your eyes. So in a first-person shooter, you're always looking around, therefore you're constantly focusing in different areas of the screen, as opposed to The Sims, which, things move pretty slowly in the game. Perhaps it is the alert state that you're in, the sense of danger, so you're constantly squinting and focusing and looking for that danger. And then the final possible reason is that it's the reward. And I actually lean more towards this one, and we'll get to why in a second. But that in video games, you get rapid rewards, especially in a first-person shooter. You know if you made the right decision if you're still alive. You know if you made the wrong decision if you're no longer alive. It all happens very quickly. So if you remove the metaphor of life and death, it's a system in which you make rapid decisions and you get rewards for those systems just as rapidly. And it's something exciting about games. So what is contrast sensitivity function? Well, let's take a peek at that real quick. Night driving is a difficult thing to do. If any of you have ever been in a car wreck at night, you know that it is a terrifying thing. Having personally experienced it, I can tell you I now play more action video games to try and increase my contrast function sensitivity. But this is what you might see at night, and this is what an action gamer would see at night. They see more shades of gray. They see more shades of color. And it is an improved function that can relate to multiple areas of their lives. Of course, there are all sorts of games that have been like this for a while now, and the next one I want to talk about is a fun game that inspired some of the work that we're doing here at the University of Utah. It's a game that was based off the plot of the movie Inner Space. Now, Inner Space is a movie from the 80s that you probably don't remember, and that's okay. Just know that they shrunk down stars that we once knew and loved so they could go inside the bodies of people. And that's what the game Remission does. Remission is a game where the player is shrunk down and assumes the role of a robot going through the body blasting cancer. All right? They use the medications that the patients would be using to fight their disease. And Remission has very specific goals. The goals of Remission are to improve attitudes of young adults towards chemotherapy, because let's be honest, nobody wants to go through chemotherapy. The second thing that it tries to do is it tries to get young adults to have more agency in their drug regime, that they will take their medications on time, that they will adhere to the scheme set out by their doctors. And the findings are amazing. A mere hour of Remission has shown that there's been a shift in emotion, knowledge, and perception of chemotherapy. People know more about chemotherapy, and they have a better attitude towards it from 1 hour of play. We also know from the slides that Bob showed earlier that motivation and emotion are key to changing behavior. And that when playing a video game, unlike watching a book, or watching a movie or reading a book, I guess you could watch a book too and probably have even less results. But the brain is really alive when you're playing video games, that the limbic system is on fire, that all of the reward centers are firing, and they're firing hard. So we know that your emotions change and that positive affect can happen as a result. Our game, we also have a game for kids fighting cancer, and it's called the PE game. And the PE game has two very specific goals. The first is in the name of the game itself, patient empowerment. We know that people who believe they can beat their disease have higher success rates beating their disease. And so the PE game was modeled with that in mind. It also has another very specific angle that is unique to these types of video games. It is designed to help young people in the hospital get exercise. Most children get their exercise through play. It is very difficult to play in a hospital. Most people in the hospital get their exercise by going to the gym, walking around the floors, or going to physical therapy. None of these are well suited for children to get their exercise. So as a result, children very rarely get the exercise they need while in the hospital. And so the PE game is designed to tackle both those issues. Data for the PE game, including why we chose superheroes, was taken from qualitative research up at the hospitals. We went to children's rooms, we looked at what kind of posters they had on the walls, we spoke to social workers and physical therapists to vet everything that we have in this and to draw the data that motivates us and push it into it's exciting. Okay, so the PE game uses some move controllers. And the move controller is similar to a Lego, in that it's something you hold in your hand and you move up and down in physical space. I would want to repeat this if you're not working experts on it, but you can get a tremendous amount of cardiovascular activity through upper body exercises. The exercises were all designed so that they can play with one or two hands, because there are chemotherapy. Sitting, standing, one-handed, or notice that at all times there are 4 players on the board, each of which is one part, and throw the big cross away. And the reason is because children very rarely fight while adults... How's that? Much better. While adults might fight diseases alone, children are very rarely alone in the hospital. So we wanted to have the game both multiplayer, and if they do play it alone, they see that community that works with them. It is a project that has garnered a lot of interest, and it has already been published in Science. So there's a lot of people interested in this project, and this project is continuing on. Right now, it is in a prototype phase, meaning that it is a bare bones system. We are testing it currently up at the hospital right now, up at Children's, and we have patients currently enrolled in that trial. We're moving forward with it this summer, and we're quite excited about it. Another project that we're working on here at the University of Utah is the Treadport. And the Treadport has gotten a lot of attention over the past few years. both because it is a very noble project helping spinal cord injury patients, but also because it's highly innovative. The Treadport is a giant treadmill that measures about 6 feet wide that you can stand on and walk and turn right and left on. It also has a couple of unique features. The first is the harness not only supports the patient, but you'll notice there's a bar on the back of the patient. And what that bar does is it gently pulls or pushes on the patient as they're walking on the treadmill. And that pushing and pulling is surprisingly important. When you walk on a treadmill, you actually expend 35% less energy than if you were walking in the real world. And the reason for that is, on a treadmill, the tread is moving beneath you. On our planet, the planet, despite what you may have been led to believe by cartoons, isn't spinning under your feet at the same rate at which you're walking. So you're always pushing your own force. You have to overcome inertia when you walk in the real world as opposed to walking on a treadmill. So by slightly pushing against patients while they're walking, it more accurately simulates what walking feels like and the energy required to walk. Also, by pushing slightly harder or pulling against them, you can simulate moving up or downhill without adjusting the angle of the treadmill. And that's important because spinal cord injury patients are having gait problems, meaning that their walk isn't what it once was. So you don't want to raise a treadmill and have somebody trip or fall. The game itself that we created is a game that simulates a farm environment. So patients can wander around this farm and they can elect to opt into games. We have a snipe hunt where these birds run around and you try to catch them. There are a series of coins to collect and all sorts of hidden things along the way. We know that people who use this system exercise more voluntarily than without it. Again, spinal cord injury is not a comfortable position to be in. And the young men and women who are faced with this injury are doing more therapy voluntarily because of these types of systems. So it's making a real impact on their lives. Real quickly, I'm going to blitz through a couple of other games that we're working on before we get to our final points. Reflex Speed is an exciting game that does cross-hemisphere training, meaning that you move your right hand and your left foot at the same time to increase reaction speed. For a long time, people believed that your reaction speed was set, that you couldn't get faster than you initially were. And science is proving that out to be not true. And so Reflex Speed is a game that we're collaborating with a startup company here in Salt Lake City to make a system that makes people faster. The NHL is interested in it, football players have been interested in it, and we have all sorts of people knocking down our door to play the early prototype of this game. A little secret, it is a total prototype. The pad that we're stomping on is a DDR pad, a dance pad that has been reskinned for this game. Just don't tell anybody. Converse is a game that helps people with autism learn dating skills. And we're currently working on a diabetes game that involves activity monitors. So you strap on an activity monitor, you move around, and you see an avatar of yourself on screen. You see the impact of that on your health and on your blood sugar levels. Oops. So what are we doing with all of this stuff then? We can show studies that that games improve the body, that games improve the mind. And really what we want to get to is this idea of people at play and looking at play. That adults at play may be at their best, that they are creative, that they are engaged, that they are exercising, both their mind and their body. And how does that work? Why is play so important? There are a bunch of theories that motivate play. One of them is this notion of flow. And flow is a theory that gets used in game design a lot. Flow is this notion that if you increase the skill required of a player at the same time of increasing their challenge, a state of flow will occur. So the chart makes sense. So if something is, if you have low skill and the challenge is high, that's a really stressful situation. Think about if you were dumped off at a golf course and you've never played golf before. It's dismal. On the other hand, if you have high skill and low challenge, you're bored. Imagine playing t-ball with 8-year-olds, right? You're going to walk up there and you're going to say, yeah, you know, this is pretty easy. But if you get it just right, if you can increase the difficulty of an activity at the same time as someone's skill increases, you achieve a state of flow. What is flow? Flow is what gamers call being in the zone. It's when you sit down to play a game for 15 minutes and you end up playing for 5 hours unknowingly. A sense of timelessness occurs. You lose track of time. You lose track of what's going on. I think this is what's happening in Snow World. that people lose track of what's happening and they're fully engaged in the game and therefore able to get treatment without having to have more morphine. I also believe that safe and rapid play is one of the biggest strengths that games have. That you make lots of decisions in games. Just to move a character around in a game, you have to move your hands, you have to plot in advance where the character is going to go. You have to use the controls to make the character move on screen, much less jump over pipes or grab balloons or fly an airplane or whatever the game happens to be. You make an incredibly large amount of decisions, which is different than other forms of media. When you watch TV, you make one decision. What TV show am I going to watch? You might make additional decisions about having a snack while watching a TV show. And you might make decisions to imagine or argue with the TV show. The character shouldn't do that. This person is a horrible actor. I can't believe commercials are this long. So you might have some running commentary, but it's actually a few decisions. In games, you have to process a massive amount of information very rapidly. Lots of changes are happening on screen. And it is a safe place to play and make mistakes. T-ball and kickball are not safe places to make mistakes. Any of you who have played a team sport know that you let down the team when you make mistakes. And that can either open you up to friendly ribbing or horrible ridicule, depending on the quality of your team. You get immediate and concrete feedback when you play a game. When you whack the mole in whack-a-mole, the mole either disappears or doesn't disappear. So you know immediately what's happening. I think this safe, rapid play is the key to all of this. So what's my walk-away point then? When we're talking about games, I want you to worry less and wonder more. Games are being measured and are having a profound positive impact on our lives. And so there have been lots of studies and lots of work, especially in the last 10 years, worrying about the violent effects of games, but more and more studies are being done about the positive psychological and physiological effects of games. So I want to invite you to wonder about those with me, because we're going to be doing some exciting stuff in that area. Thank you.
Hi, I'm terrified of this mic at this moment. So that's me. So guess who got the short end of the stick? Lots of studies, not so much. So someone who is much wiser and smarter than myself once noted this about people and about games. This idea that you can learn more about someone from watching them play for an hour than you could by just talking to them for a whole year. It's often misattributed to Plato, which is why I had that little note there. And I'm not sure where it comes from, but I do know that it's someone who's smarter and definitely more insightful. And the meaning of this quote is that basically we learn about someone by playing because they reveal something about themselves. We can think of games or the act of play as a window to the soul. By means of example, let's say that I was to stand up here and tell you guys that I play chess for fun, and that the other day I was playing chess with my 3-year-old nephew, and I totally beat him, because he's really, really bad at chess, and I am so great. I am so awesome, aren't I? We actually have a word for this kind of behavior in games and in sports. This notion of sportsmanship. If you're curious, the guy on the right was actually disqualified. I think he had come in second or third, and he basically ended up with nothing because he wasn't able to play the game correctly, in this case, the race. What this means is that how you play is often more important than what you play. Whatever the game might be, it is how do you approach that and how do you relate to the game and to other people you might be playing with is actually representative of the person. Okay, and I'm going to argue today that what you play can actually help with that too. So if you're playing the right kinds of games or you're playing the games in the right way, you might actually become a better person. Okay, and that's perhaps the biggest takeaway that I want you to take from this part of the talk. So before we jump into that, I think it's important that we sort of establish some ground rules. So the first thing is that games are basically a form of culture. And it's important that we start to recognize them as such, the same way that we think of movies, the seventh art, and we think of poetry and theater and novels. Games are in that same category, okay? And that's important because they're a form of culture that they also communicate values, right? The people that make games have their values in their games, right? And when we play games, we read into them. We understand certain things from games, okay? So my argument for today is that basically, if we believe that games have values, then it makes sense that players can respond to these. You might respond with emotions, you might respond with empathy, you might respond with a reflection, lots of different things. And this means that you can actually have an ethical experience with the game, which is something that I'm sure many of you have had, but maybe you haven't recognized it as such. And if we can have an ethical experience with the game, well, there's an opportunity for learning. There's an opportunity for reflection as well, opportunity for becoming a better person. Okay? So you might wonder, well, what do you mean by games communicate values? Maybe that phrase is still resonating with some of you. So I'm going to try to explain how games do this. Many of you have played a lot of games, so this might make more sense. You might be familiar with some of these ideas. So it's important that we look at how they're designed. And there's two different approaches. One I like to call the open ethical design approach, which is an approach where the game allows a player to experiment with his or her own values, right? Whoever you are, come into the game, who do you want to be in this game, and the game will adapt to that and let you kind of play around and do things. Closed ethical design, on the other hand, is a game that basically gives you a fixed position, okay? And it's a position that you might not agree with, it might not be your own position, but by playing the game, you'll engage with that, and you'll perhaps have some moment of, some sort of reflection. You might have some issues with that, some dissonance between what you're tasked to do and how you feel about it, and that can also create these moments for reflection. Let's talk about open ethical design first. These are games where you often see players creating their own codes of conduct, their own behaviors, deciding what is correct, what is incorrect in the game. They're games where players often experience what we call social dilemmas. You're playing with other people and you need to negotiate and figure out what's acceptable behavior, for example, in the game. And we see this a lot in MMOs, or massively multiplayer online games, where players need to figure out what does it mean to play the game, but also how do you relate to others in the game. As an example of how this is happening, we see a lot of new words being sort of coined and thrown out there that reflect different behaviors. So if someone accuses you of griefing or accuses you of twinking, that can either be a good thing or a bad thing, right? But it's interesting that these player communities are actually developing new language to talk about ethical behavior or unethical behavior in the game. Another example of open ethical design is in games where basically you, the player, get to decide what you want to do or how you want to approach the game. Okay. In this case, what we see is games where your values are somehow acknowledged by the game. The game recognizes that you're trying to behave in a certain way. These are games where you can explore different moral positions. You can be a good guy or a bad guy, and the game will recognize that you're trying to act as a good guy or a bad guy. These games often have explicit moral frameworks. And these are frameworks where certain actions might be awarded good points or bad points. And I'm using them in quotes here. It's sort of up to you if you agree with them, or different games will label them differently too. Fable is a nice example of a series that has done that consistently. And here the idea is that you can choose a certain path to take. You want to go down the good path or down the bad path, or maybe kind of be wishy-washy and go down the middle. That's entirely up to you. So for example, in the case of Fable, there's an early mission, I believe it's one of the tutorial missions, where the player is tasked by a woman to find out if her husband is cheating on him. And so you're the player, you're playing this little kid, and you run around and you basically find the husband, and you discover that yes, in fact, the husband is being unfaithful to his wife. And then the husband turns to the kid and says, hey, little kid, how about some money and you stay quiet about what you've witnessed? And then the player gets to decide, well, what do you want to do? Do you want to accept the bribe or reject the bribe? If you say yes to the bribe, you basically get 2 evil points and you get some money. If you say no, you get 2 good points, but you don't get any money from the husband, right? Now, interestingly enough, in this case, you can actually accept the bribe and then squeal anyways, in which case you get a lot of money and the evil cancels out. So you get like evil points and then good points, and it all comes out a wash, which is perhaps another interesting position to take. Some cases about these missions. In other games, you see it done differently too. So there's a lot of Star Wars games. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this idea of the Force and there's good and evil. So in a lot of these Star Wars games, you can choose what you want to do. And at some point in the game, or perhaps in the beginning, the choice you make gives you certain options in the game. So for example, if you wanted to be on the good side, you do good things and then you become a Jedi, and then you get access to all these powers and abilities that you get to use in the game. You get to heal, you get to persuade, and so on. However, you can also choose the bad side, the dark side. And the dark side, well, you basically get different powers and different abilities. So your choice of playing of the game is how do you want to play it, or what do you want to do in the game. But it's also guided by the choices you've been making, good or bad. Some games will also make changes in the world. The environment itself will change depending on what choices you've made. So you can have the good side or the evil-looking side of the world, depending on what kind of in the case of this game, what kind of a deity you've chosen to be. In other games, the storyline might change. So certain characters might do certain things in the game. They might die. They might not like you anymore. The ending of the game might be entirely different based on the choices that you've made along the way. And here's just some examples of games that have done that sort of recently. So that was open ethical design. Let's talk about closed ethical design, because this is perhaps the one that most of you might be thinking of when you see a lot of games that seem to be very objectionable on the surface. So in these kinds of games, you need to relate to them by means of your own values. And that normally implies that you need to kind of give in, or like to call suspend your disbelief and kind of go along with what the game is asking you to do. Okay. So there's some examples of games where I say have a lot of closed ethical design. 3 of those 4 games are games where you are basically a criminal. And you're doing really bad things. And what's interesting is that by doing these bad things in the game, it's not that you're condoning the actions of the characters in the game, but rather you are reflecting on your own values. Because you can't change the game. Right? You can't really play Manhunt and be a good guy. You know, the game requires that you kill people and that you be really brutal about it. There's sort of no way around that. And that way, the game sort of is enforcing a certain behavior from the player, but it is challenging your values. Right. It is getting you to think about, well, what am I actually doing in this game, and how do I feel about these kinds of actions? What are my feelings about that? And could I live with myself if I was doing this in the real world? Some games do it like that. Some games do it perhaps in more subtle ways. So there's a game called Shadow of the Colossus, which is really interesting. In the beginning of the game, you're not really given much of a story or backstory or context, but you're this guy and there's a horse, and you ride around on your horse, and you kill these really big hulking brutes, like colossi, right? And they sort of these big monsters that are sort of walking around, and they're really slow, and you sort of climb up them, and then you basically have to kill all of them. I think there's 12. But about halfway through the game, the player starts to realize and starts to question themselves, like, why am I killing these guys? There's these big brutes, but they're not monsters. They never attack me. They're not killing other things. They're not destroying the landscape or killing nature or anything. What's going on here? And there's a sort of subtle shift in the tone of the game as you realize, you start to question that maybe you thought you were the hero, but maybe you're actually not the hero. Maybe you're the villain in this case, right? And it turns out that you're being sort of the selfish person who is killing all his monsters as a way to bring your loved one back from the dead. Clearly a bad idea, okay? Now, you might be curious, especially if you don't play a lot of games, is this really effective? Am I making stuff up here? Am I hoping that this might work, that people would react? And I would say yes. And I want to give you a brief example of why this is effective and how it works, and hopefully in a way that you can relate. So I'm assuming that many of you might have seen this movie, Batman movie. So it's an interesting movie. A lot of really exciting stuff is going on. There's one particular scene which involves 2 ferries. One ferry is loaded with civilians, and the other ferry is loaded with criminals. And the Joker, who's sort of the villain in the movie, has basically planted explosive devices on each ferry and provided each ferry with a detonator. And the catch is that the detonators are crossed. So the detonator on the prisoner's ferry will detonate the ferry with the innocent people and vice versa. Right? So it presents us with basically a moral dilemma. Right? And it's a really effective dilemma in the case of this movie. It's a really gripping moment in the movie. What is going to happen? How are they going to get out of this situation? Is there some solution or something? And essentially, that's what moral dilemmas do in media, in movies or in books or whatever. It poses the question to the audience: what would you do in this situation? Right? If I was on the ferry, on the civilian ferry, not on the prisoner ferry, what would I do? Would I dive overboard? Would I push the button? Not push the button? What is the correct solution to this? And that's why they're dilemmas. There is no easy answer. Okay. In fact, we have another term for these kinds of situations in media. We call it drama. Right? These are dramatic situations. And dramatic situations are those where the characters are placed in these really tough moral situations that they seem to have no solution. So drama places us in these situations, and we, the audience, are sort of captivated by what's going on. We sort of witnessing the turmoil of the characters on screen, and we're really, really involved with that on 2 levels. We're involved on an intellectual level. The intellectual level is what I like to think of as a problem-solving level. So I'm in the movie theater, I'm watching these people on the boat, and I'm stroking my chin, and I'm going, oh, they're so stupid, they need to do this. Or, oh, why didn't they think of that? And I'm thinking of sort of ways out. Right? Thinking, oh, no, you should have done the following thing. That was so silly of you. That was the obvious answer was to, everybody on the count of 3, and we all dive off the side of the boat. There we go. So that's the intellectual level, right? It gets you into problem-solving mode, and you're trying to solve this problem. And you can do that because you're in a safe seat, right? You're in the audience. I'm not on the boat. I'm watching other people be on the boat, okay? But it also gets us emotionally, which is through empathy, right? We're connected to these characters. We care about these characters. We can imagine ourselves in that situation, and we connect, right? I have kids now, so whenever I'm seeing a movie and there's little kids and they're in peril, I'm like, because, I have kids and I can relate to that somehow. People with pets, will get all teary when there's movies where pets are in danger and so on. So movies, that's how drama works, on those two levels. Now, when I ask you about games, I say, well, in games, can you watch? Yeah, you can watch. So that means both of these are, we hit both of those on the head, right? But in games, there's something else. You can also act. And that makes a really, really big difference. You might have had an ethical experience with a game if you're ever doing something game and then felt guilty about it, or you felt regret about it, or you felt remorse, or you're embarrassed to talk about it, something you did in the game. Or maybe you spent more time thinking about what you wanted to do than actually doing it. Oh man, should I kill this character or let this character die or not? And then you go home and you think about it and then you try to figure out what the best solution is and so on. And what I would argue, sort of coming back to this original phrase, yes, games can be a window to the soul because as we play, we reveal much about our character, but we can also learn about our character. And that's what's special about games. That's what's different about games. You don't really get that from movies, okay? Because basically games are fundamentally about choices. And not only choices, but the consequences of those choices, okay? In games, we get to make choices we might not be able to make in the real world. But we also get to learn from those consequences. In the real world, you basically, or in other media, if you will, there is one ending. That's the ending you get. In life, you only get one shot at it. You could screw it up. You can try to make amends. You can maybe next time try to do something differently. But there's only one ending. And games have this idea of different endings. You can always ask yourself the question of the what if. What if I did this other thing instead? How would that be different? Would that be better? Would that be worse? Would I feel better about myself or not? And I like to argue that you can have these kinds of experiences in all sorts of games, right? They're not just the games that say, this is a game with ethical situations inside, right? All it takes really is for us to, first of all, play games, reflect on our experiences with those games while we are playing or after we're playing, and make the most of them. Really think about what these situations are. What does it mean about you, the player, when you choose to do something in the game that might be reprehensible outside? Maybe it's the right choice, but maybe it isn't, and that's something you need to think about. So to wrap up, for centuries now we have studied how the mind, the body, and the soul work. Now it is time to study how they play. Welcome to the century of play. We've got work to do. Thank you very much.